Hey, would you like to hear about a really sexy Japanese game from the mid-90s? Well, bad luck, we're here to talk about a really creepy Japanese game from the mid-90s. But a game which has some pretty interesting ideas about narrative structure, which would go on to be really quite influential. It's well worth talking about. Let's go take a look. Welcome to Well, actually, welcome to A Girl Who Chants Love at the Bound of the World, which is roughly how the game's title translates from the Japanese. Is, if anything, a subtitle, but if I were to full name the game throughout this video, the video would be an hour long, so it is. Is a game which feels like it's at war with itself. Specifically, it feels like it's been produced by the film production studio we see at the beginning of classic screwball comedy Sullivan's Travels.
I want this picture to be a commentary on modern conditions, stark realism, the problems that confront the average man.
But with a little sex.
A little, but I don't want to stress it.
Sadly, I've not been able to find interviews about the game's development with the game's lead designer and writer, Hiroyuki Kanno, as he tragically died in 2011, aged only 43, so I can only guess at what the actual production of the game was like. But it's clear that this is a game which desperately wants to involve you in a complex sci-fi thriller of parallel realities and time travel. And a little sex. Well, a lot of sex, actually. I'm not particularly prudish when it comes to nudity and sex in my media, blame the whole being half French thing. But the original PC-98 version of doesn't so much step over the line between erotic thriller and pornography as make an Olympic record attempt at long jumping it. This leads to an odd situation where anyone here for the drama has to put up with occasional pauses for shoehorned in sex scenes, and anyone who wants a bit of anime grumble is going to have to wade through hours of exposition and puzzling to get their rewards. There are later ports available which remove the pornographic content, but they all have their own issues and/or barriers to entry, which I'll get into later in this review, and which potentially makes the PC-98 version the primary point of entry for English speakers, Brustwarzen and all. If that weren't sufficient for me to not recommend this to the average person, there's also the fact that frequently commits one of the original sins of Japanese adventure games. Those moments where the only way to progress is to click on an arbitrary number of things across an arbitrary number of screens in order to trigger an arbitrary change. They may have been part and parcel of the genre at the time, but they're positively exhausting as a mechanic. There are, in other words, a lot of things that make this a hard game to recommend. So, why am I talking about it? Why make the effort to go back to a game from 1996 just to give it a kicking? The reason is that, despite everything I've just said, is secretly a brilliant milestone achievement in the development of the Japanese adventure game, and for all its flaws, it's well worth investigating. So, the first question then. What is Depending where you read, you'll likely see it described as either a visual novel or as an adventure game. If you're wondering what the distinction is between those two genres, that's honestly up for debate, even within Japanese game developer circles. Just take a look at these contrasting quotes taken from John Szczepaniak's The Untold History of Japanese Game Developers, where we have Kotaro Uchikoshi of Zero Escape, 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, and Virtue's Last Reward fame, and Ryukishi07, creator of the critically lauded Higurashi When They Cry and Umineko When They Cry series, as well as lead writer for Silent Hill F, giving quite different interpretations of the genre. The only key point of agreement is that the genre is not clearly defined. So ultimately there is no hard and fast rule. However, a commonly applied approach is to consider visual novels to be a subgenre of the adventure game, which has specific limitations in place. In a visual novel, you can't get stuck, you just keep doing things and the story progresses. You may have choices to make that branch the story, but you don't need to solve any puzzles to make progress. This marks the visual novel as a variant on the earlier sound novel, as invented by Chunsoft with Otogiriso in 1991. And in lieu of a strict definition, I think it's a useful way to think of the genre. So, with all that in mind, is a visual novel, or is it an adventure game? The answer to that question is a resounding yes. Which is to say it's a game which opens and closes with a roughly 4-hour visual novel, but has a 30-plus hour adventure game making up the central primary section of the game. This isn't a subtle division either. The game communicates its movement between modes by completely changing its interface as it moves from prologue to main game, and from main game to epilogue. As the game opens, it presents as the archetypal menu-driven visual novel. A nice first-person view of your environment fills the screen, with portraits and dialogue boxes appearing as you encounter other characters, and every so often you get a small list of options to pick from. None of these are true branching choices, rather you just keep interacting with things until the story advances. Simple, straightforward, extremely typical of visual novels of the time. Once you hit the main part of the game, however, the interface dramatically changes. Suddenly you have a cursor to control instead of menus to scroll through, and in what had been a neutral borders place is this wonderful piece of over-designed esoterica. Why yes, you can click on those pill-like things and something happens. Something which can actually completely bugger you if you don't know what you're doing, so maybe read the manual first. One thing that should be evident from what I've shown so far is just how evocative the game is. A common criticism of Uno is that its character art isn't the best, and I'd be inclined to agree, even ignoring the objectification of almost every female character in the game. However, the background and interface art is always on point, and it's matched by a wonderful soundtrack. This is a game which makes the PC-98 sing, with the sadly departed Ryo Umemoto showing true mastery over the Yamaha YM2608 FM synthesizer. Just give it a listen. Honestly, if there's one thing you should take away from this video, it's that the PC-98 was host to some truly stylish video games. Many of them were also, yes, extremely pornographic, but by the mid-90s, with the architecture well into its teenage years, Japanese developers knew how to make the most out of the PC-98. That more of its library has never been translated outside of Japan is a real loss. Presentation aside, the reason Uno is beloved and influential is due to its narrative design, and the way said narrative is integrated with the game's interactive elements. Uno opens about as generically as can be imagined. You play the role of, and prepare to have your mind blown here, a Japanese high school student. You're approaching the end of your studies, and it swiftly becomes apparent that you are not doing brilliantly at school. In fact, as you talk to your teachers and classmates, they make it clear that things have really gone off the rails over the past couple of months, coinciding, oddly enough, with the presumed death of your father. Can't imagine why those two things would go hand in hand. It's over the course of this introduction that the strength of the game's characterization becomes apparent. Protagonist Takuya narrates the story to himself, and while he presents things as he sees them, it becomes clear that he's an unreliable narrator when it comes to his own feelings. He consistently presents only anger and frustration towards his father, both when reflecting on his disappearance, and in regular flashbacks to scenes of everyday life at home. He's adamant that the only hurt he feels is sympathy for his stepmother over the loss of her husband, and that he is otherwise unaffected by the presumed death of his father. All of which is contradicted by the evidence we're seeing from other characters' descriptions of the change in Takuya's behaviour following the disappearance. This presentation of a teenager dealing with bereavement by putting up a front and acting up is extremely believable. It's lent further nuance by the fact that many of the criticisms that Takuya targets at his father's behaviour describe behaviours that we see in Takuya himself, a simultaneous reflection of the tendency of children to follow at least somewhat in their parents' footsteps, and also of our heightened ability to recognise flaws in others when we happen to share those flaws. This conflict between the protagonist's self-image and their behaviour is a hint of what's to come in terms of the game's supporting cast. No character in this game is a monolith, no matter how stereotypical their initial presentation may seem. For the many flaws in the presentation of its female cast, Uno does a good job of providing them with multifaceted personalities. More, it's refreshing to note that Takuya, for all his bravado, is just a teenager, and this results in the female cast in many scenarios being the more dynamic parties. The ones who know how to stand up to dangerous situations where Takuya freezes or is otherwise ineffective. Characters that he sees as damsels in distress just as often end up being his knight in shining armour. Simply put, the game doesn't fall into the trap of equating the playable protagonist with its designated hero in every situation, and the story is stronger for it. Something I wish more games, Persona, would consider doing. It's just a shame that the same doesn't go for sex appeal, as the female cast are undermined by their unbelievable universal attraction to Takuya. The game may be willing to reject the power fantasy of heroism, but it fully commits to the sexual fantasy of being desired by all, even as Takuya's abrasive teenage personality renders that fantasy all the more unbelievable. I guess we can't have everything. While the characterization in Uno is good, it's not so exceptional that it would make the game a milestone achievement. So what is it, precisely, that makes Uno special? And this is the point where I'm going to talk about spoilers and content warnings. I'm not going to be showing any sex scenes in this video, nor am I going to spoil the ending of the story or the details of any of its branches. I'm not going to touch upon its most problematic triggering events either, but if you are planning to play the game, I would strongly recommend reading into them elsewhere. The game gets properly grim at some points, and it has some egregiously, gratuitously gross events that you have to click through. I am, however, going to discuss the game's structure, including the primary hook of its story. This is something you'll hit within the opening hour of the game, but if you want to go in completely blind, you may want to skip towards the time showing on your screen now, where I cover the options you'll have for playing the game and their relative merits. For everyone else, onwards. The clue to Yuno's real strength is in its dramatic shift in interface as it enters its main section. You see, the game's transition out of the prologue comes as Takuya is threatened at gunpoint, only to black out and then wake up at the same location with his attacker nowhere to be seen. What exactly is going on? Well, it gradually becomes clear that Takuya is in the same place geographically, but is several days in the past. He has a chance to redo the next few days and to try to figure out exactly what's happening, and ideally avoid getting shot at the end of it. Now, a time loop adventure game would be relatively uncommon on its own, but as a story hook it's hardly unheard of in science fiction more broadly. What makes things interesting, and what may sound uncannily familiar to fans of the excellent Virtue's Last Reward for instance, is the way this is handled within the interactive narrative of the game. You see, the strange interface that appears when Takuya wakes up is an interface which allows him to navigate in time. It presents a simple map extending rightwards as time passes, and branching vertically as Takuya takes certain actions. Takuya cannot freely traverse this map, but he can leave waypoints. By using a small pearl from the bottom right of the interface, he leaves a marker that he can return to at will. Only when he starts the main part of the game, he has only 2 pearls, and if he ever places both of them, he can no longer traverse the map at all, meaning it's quite possible to lock yourself out of being able to return to previous moments, which is a bit of a problem. As you progress through the story, you'll find yourself trying to pick a route towards the tantalising extra pearls visible on your map from the outset, and once you have a few more in stock, it's a lot easier to place pearls without worrying about stranding yourself in time. But until you've stocked up, you'll find yourself very wary about placing your limited pearls on the map. The way Yuno integrates this map with its puzzles is its smartest piece of design. This isn't a simple choose-your-own-adventure where you can travel back to try different options, though that aspect is present. The more crucial element is that many story branches aren't available to you until you've acquired the right item from another branch. It's not always clear what this item might be, or even what the specific moment that causes the branch is, and stumbling onto a new item and having that spark of realisation is absolutely wonderful, if potentially frustrating when you realise that you hadn't placed a waypoint anywhere near the branch you now want to return to. This friction is something that later games inspired by Yuno generally remove. Going back to Virtue's Last Reward again, that's a game where you can freely travel around its map, where blocked branches are communicated to you clearly, as is the moment that they unlock, where what you need to unlock those avenues is simply for your character to become aware of certain facts. Yuno, by contrast, makes you do the legwork. You will make mistakes and have to retrace your steps extensively. You will accidentally lose items and have to return to previous branches to regain them once more. And frankly, I love that added friction. While there are some scene-level puzzles within the game, the primary puzzle of the game is that of navigating its map, figuring out the routes to get you more pearls, figuring out what items you need and when you need them, and having that be an actual challenge makes it all the more satisfying to untangle. This is a game where you'll quickly realise that you actually need to draw your own map. The in-game map is unlabelled, and you'll want to keep track of what choices lead to which branches and where certain items can reliably be located. In a lot of ways, it scratches the same itch that a blobber does, only instead of mapping out dungeons, you're mapping out narrative paths. This branching is coupled with a range of intertwined stories of escalating stakes and complexity, effectively taking advantage of the time loop structure to tell what is almost an anthology piece, each route focusing on a portion of the story distinctive enough to stand alone. It's just a bit of a shame that, as you find yourself hurtling towards an exciting conclusion at the end of any of these paths, Takuya piecing things together and desperately trying to get a handle on and deal with some kind of dramatic, challenging situation, it's precisely at this point that the game will inevitably turn to you and ask, have you considered breasts? Even ignoring the nature of these scenes, they're simply momentum killers, and while the paths still generally conclude satisfactorily, they never quite regain their pacing after interruptus coitus. There is one other crucial element to the design, which might seem an obvious choice to a modern observer, but is actually another example of the innovation that Yuno is bringing to the adventure game. Each route has a distinct story in its own conclusion, but at the same time they're all working towards a denouement that is, well, quite the thing. I won't necessarily say that I love the game's conclusion, but it's the kind of ending beloved of sci-fi short stories. A wild, dramatic scenario out of left field. And having the player need to earn this final conclusion by completing the other paths gives the game the space it needs to flesh out its setting, its concepts, and its recurring characters in a way that a linear narrative couldn't offer. In some ways, the game owes a debt of inspiration to Chunsoft's Kamaitachi no Yoru, aka Banshee's Last Cry, a 1994 sound novel where you repeatedly try to survive, and have as many other people survive, the night in a cabin with a murderer. However, while that game also uses its multiple routes to help flesh things out, it is very much one story with multiple routes, most of which conclude with a bad ending and encouraging you to use trial and error to reach the good ending, as opposed to Yuno's multiple complementary paths building up to a central ending. It's easy to see why the game had a huge impact on the Japanese adventure game genre. The complex characters, the incorporation of narrative divergence into the game's puzzles, the wild turns of the story. Yuno offers a bold, memorable approach to the adventure game. And yes, a little sex. It won multiple awards following its release and ended up getting ported to the Sega Saturn, with its sex scenes toned down, where it won yet more awards. It also got a port to Windows a few years later, and its reputation was such that it ultimately ended up getting a modern remake on PlayStations 4 and Vita in 2017, and in turn said remake was ported to the PlayStation 5 and the Switch. Unsurprisingly, all of the console versions from Saturn onwards remove the pornography, so you might think, there's an easy approach to enjoying the game without encountering its grottier content. Alas, things aren't quite so simple. First up is the fact that a lot of the issues with the game are not removed by simply removing the sex scenes. You might not get to see your character getting it on, but even the incidental art is so horny as to be distracting. Less of a male gaze in this game as a male leer. And even if you don't get to see the relationships as consummation in detail, there are several cases in the game where the relationships themselves are objectionable in nature, and that remains icky no matter what. Nevertheless, there's no doubt that the Saturn version of the game, by cutting back on the actual pornography, benefits from somewhat improved pacing. No longer must you sit through overlong, unfast-forwardable sex scenes in the middle of an otherwise tense moment of the story. That does still replace them with reasonably lengthy conversations relating to the characters' relationship. The Saturn version also introduces voiced speech, and though the resolution is lower, it manages to provide a good interpretation of the PC-98's original presentation. It does unfortunately suffer from poorly converted music, which is a significant blow, but the real barrier here is simply that this version has never received a translation patch, so unless you can speak and read Japanese, you won't be able to get much out of this version of the game. So that leaves the two other options, the Windows port and the later console remake. The Windows port does indeed have a fan translation, but it's exactly the same game as the PC-98 version, only with worse audio quality, plus some added scenes and voice acting from the Saturn version. So a reasonable alternative, but doesn't actually help with any of the issues of the PC-98 original. And as for the remake, well, basically answers the question, what if Yuno no longer had sex scenes, but also had all of its aesthetic charm erased in favour of whatever the hell this is? It's still as creepily objectifying as ever, but now all the adult women look like children, and also we got rid of the gnarly interface and replaced it with this sort of semi-invisible yet really intrusive interface, which also means we no longer have the cool transition between interface modes when we leave the prologue and enter the main game. Boo. Oh, and also, the official English translation that these versions received is somehow weaker than the fan translation, though it does at least elide that version's questionable decision to have all the characters throw the R word around with gay abandon, so there is that. The music is also solid, including an option to use the PC-98 original, so no complaints on that front. So, for the non-Japanese speaker, your choices come down to fan translations of the PC-98 original or its Windows port, both of which voice their full sex scenes upon you, or the 2017 remake, which elides the sex scenes, but loses a lot of the original's aesthetic charm. Either way, you're stuck with endless fan service and a deeply misogynistic protagonist. Pick your poison, I guess. So, do I recommend the game? That's a difficult question to answer. I fervently believe that it contains greatness, that its contributions to adventure game design are notable and well worth experiencing. I also believe that its flaws are significant and a serious detriment to the game's narrative and enjoyability. I think that if the game sounds interesting to you, you should go out and give it a try. You'll quickly get a feel of whether you can look past its glaring issues or not. I really wish I could offer a stronger recommendation than that, but the truth is that there were plenty of moments during my playthrough where I was actively having a bad time. And much as I wouldn't fault anybody for choosing to not watch the jazz singer, even though it's an important moment in film history, I certainly don't expect everyone to put themselves through discomfort for the sake of engaging with a foundational take on the branching sci-fi adventure. Hey, at least you sat through a 20-minute video about the game, that's not nothing. Hopefully the next game I cover will be one with fewer caveats. Thanks for watching another of my videos. Hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found it informative, if not necessarily making you want to rush out and buy the game. I do promise that I like games other than adventure games. It's just been a bit of a run of them for me lately, and also apologies for the slight delay between videos. April and May are weirdly busy times for me at work and in my personal life. It kind of gets in the way. Hopefully the next video should be a little sooner, and hopefully it'll also be about a game that I can actually heartily recommend to you. Either way, until then, see you around.